some of the Pharisees by saying you can look out and see it's orange or red in the first heaven and say, oh, it's going to rain. Oh, a storm's coming up. But you can't determine the times or the seasons. Right. Yet I gave Israel the revelation to look up and determine it. But you don't look up and determine it.
Yeah.
So that's an amazing revelation from the Holy Spirit. Okay, any questions about that?
I just have a little question about, I was thinking of Revelation 12 sign that is going to be displayed by the constellation of Virgo and Leo and the planet. But then what will be that constellation that will represent that dragon that you mentioned?
Right. This is interesting because the actual constellation of the woman, all right, that we see specifically says there are sun, moon, and stars. But the dragon does not say anything about sun, moon, and stars. It talks about heads and horns.
Oh, yeah.
And that's interesting because it's focusing on the casting down of the dragon to earth, and then the structure as he comes out of the sea. So what's interesting about this is when Israel is called the sand of the seashore on earth, and then the stars in the heaven, it's referring to the footstool on the first and then the second heaven. So when John walks to the sand of the seashore and looks out in the sea, we would automatically think he means literally water, but he doesn't mean that. He means nations and peoples. So when Israel's border ends, everything else is considered sea, even though it's land, because the nations are seen as the seas. So he's talking about the multitude. This beast comes out of the Gentile nations, the one that rises out of the seas. But there's another beast that comes out of the land of Israel, the false prophet. It comes out of the earth. But this beast is interesting because when it appears, it immediately assumes a certain structure on earth to mirror the structure that it had in heaven. So it was attacking the throne of God in heaven using that structure. Now it's going to attack the throne of God on earth using that structure, which means David's throne, which is an everlasting throne. So it's immediately going to start attacking Judah. And as we see in Revelation 12, that's exactly what happens. It starts attacking Judah. Now the reason this is interesting is when this plays out on earth, we're going to notice as nations start lining up against Israel, they're going to take a certain pattern. And Netanyahu brought that up today in his speech at the United Nations. Notice he's addressing the United Nations. The 70 nations that came against Israel right before Trump became president assumed that pattern. Because in Hebrew, when a number is given, it's given us specific reason. It's not random, it's not arbitrary, it's not coincidental. 7 and 10. 7 times 10 is 70. Which is interesting because there are 70 patriarchs in Genesis 10, in what's known as the Table of Nations. So the 70 nations had already lined up against Israel. And Netanyahu brought that up today. How the United Nations' goal, it seems, is to come against Israel no matter what. They're renaming places. They renamed the Cave of the Patriarchs and said it belongs to Palestine. It never belonged to Israel.
Crazy.
So what's interesting is Netanyahu brought this up, and he called it his Rosh Hashanah speech, his Yom Teruah speech, because that is actually the time that they're preparing for right now. And what's interesting, if you take 10 and 7 and put it together, you get 17. Now, throughout the Bible, 17 is the number of resurrection.
Wow.
Christ rose on the 17th day of the first month. He went and taught on the 17th day of the 7th month when he stood up and said, I'm the living waters, in John 7, the Feast of Tabernacles. So 17 is going to say that this beast is going to imitate the resurrection. So immediately, just by the numbers, comes out of the nations, imitates the resurrection, just by the numbers. So people always ask me, what do the numbers mean in this verse? And I'll say, well, what do the letters mean in that verse? Because Hebrew is an alphanumeric language just like Greek. So anytime you see a number, it's there for a very specific reason, to prove or reinforce the scripture. It's not random. So the 7-10 pattern we should see emerge, and we're seeing it emerging. It's already emerging. But what's interesting now is the United Nations wants to take a larger role in global affairs. And you just saw Trump and Netanyahu, two of the most powerful men on earth, approach the United Nations about the global crisis.
Wow.
Who was mentioned? Iran, North Korea, all right, which obviously are right on the precipice of war. And it's also interesting that, as Pastor Vieira brought up at the beginning, the distress of nations with the sea and the waves roaring are interesting, because we're seeing the sea and the waves roaring right now. And we're interested maybe only in this part of the world, but it's happening in other parts of the world. For example, Romania had a freak hurricane about a day ago.
Really?
And I think 67 people were killed
Oh, God.
and 147 injured. And they weren't even expecting a hurricane. They were expecting a little bit of rain, but a hurricane occurred right in Romania. And it's happening all over the world. I heard where in, I believe, the country of, not Nigeria, but another African nation, they're having storms on their coastline. So it's interesting that you think these things may be metaphorical, but they have a literal and a metaphorical application. And all the nations now that we look at, whether we've talked about Venezuela, and now the U.S. itself, the sea and the waves are roaring. In the Caribbean, the sea and the waves are roaring. So we're seeing this pattern, the distress of nations. Now why this is important is, out of this distress, this kingdom is going to arise. Because John says it comes right out of the sea, out of the nations. And he watches it from the land of Israel. Because the Spirit takes him into the wilderness on the Lord's day, and he beholds this vision. So we're going to watch this unfold. And 710 always has to do with the 7th month, 10th day. And that's coming up on September 30th on the Gregorian calendar. Now, we're going to watch this pattern between these two dates, because actually Yom Teruah has to do with judgment on Israel. And it's specifically designed for Israel. And it's interesting because as this plays out, we're actually going to see these dates emerge, and we're going to see if these things actually play out on the earth. Now, any questions about that before we move on? All right. So,
Are you leaving Revelation 12 right now?
no, I wasn't going to leave it. I can, but I wasn't going to.
No. I was just curious.
Okay.
I was just. It would be good for people that are listening for the first time to get them up to speed. Why is what's going on in the solar system peculiar on that day? We're talking Bible now. They might not realize that the special astronomy that is happening in the sky.
Right. So each constellation that's in the sky is actually associated with one of the tribes of Israel. For example, I'll just use Judah, the line of Judah. So the constellation, which is known as Ariel, which is also a metaphor for Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah refers to actually Ariel. He says Jerusalem is Ariel. So the line of God, the constellation, would represent Judah. And each of the constellations have a tribe associated with it. Now what's interesting is the one star that's prophetic from Genesis 49:10, when Jacob gives what will happen in the last days, is the tribe of Judah is associated with Shiloh. And Shiloh is a particular star in the constellation of Judah. In fact, it's right between the paws of the lion. It's the brightest star in the constellation of Ariel. In the Babylonian system, it's called Leo. But what's interesting is that star actually is doing things it normally doesn't do throughout the course of this month. For example, on the day of the eclipse, which was the first day of Elul, you actually saw, if you were on the path of totality, and some people saw it even if they weren't in the path of totality, but with the naked eye, you could actually see Regulus right at the sun.
Wow.
Did you see it?
Yeah, I
Crazy.
saw it.
And the reason you could see it is the sun was blocked out.
Wow.
Now, Regulus is 100 times brighter than the sun.
Huh.
In fact, it's one of the brightest stars in the
Oh
universe.
my gosh.
But because the sun is so close,
Yeah.
you normally wouldn't see it. And you only saw it because of that solar
That's
eclipse.
amazing. Huh.
And that actually happened over the continental United States. It didn't happen anywhere else in the world. Which means that will be assigned to that particular landmass. Now, another thing that makes it interesting is that star, Regulus, has a helical rising that is very unique, which means in a couple days Regulus is going to disappear, and you're not going to be able to see it in the morning and the evening. Because its unique pattern of orbit, it goes away right at the time of Yom Teruah.
Wow.
So right after the day of Yom Teruah, you're not going to be able to see it anymore. But on Yom Teruah, that star is actually going to come down and come into the constellation of the Virgin
Wow.
and crown her. And you usually don't ever see that. So that would make this constellation very unique at this time. The fact that the Virgin or Betula is actually appearing during this month is not unusual. It happens all the time. But the fact that this alignment of the stars is happening is very unusual, highly unusual. And if we get to it, we're going to see some other times when it did happen in Jewish history. All right. Now, any questions about that? And as you know, about 9 months ago, Jupiter was actually seen in the actual area of the womb of the Virgin, and now this week it's actually coming out. Jupiter's like it's being birthed, right? Like the corporate man-child in Revelation 12. So we see the conception of the church on the day of Pentecost, and now we're seeing the human gestation cycle of 9 months being played out in the stars in the second heaven. Okay. So just like it says in Psalm 19 and Psalm 119, that the heavens actually tell the story. And their speech goes through all the world. No one can say they've never seen it because it's being played out in a word picture right in the heavens.
So now the dragon in Revelation 12 is waiting, and it's really dramatic. First time you read it, you're worried that the baby is going to be consumed. And so what bearing does that have on what we're going to see in the next week?
Okay.
Astronomically.
All right, well, John picks up on that metaphor by using Pharaoh, who was a type of the dragon, and he was trying to consume all the male children when they were born on the Hebrew midwives' laps. He said, please break their necks and kill them as soon as they're born, to stop the tribe of Judah from coming into existence. And it does say he was a dragon in the Nile River, and that he did cast out a flood out of his mouth when he chased the children of Israel to the Red Sea. So John's picking up on that metaphor. He's also picking up on the metaphor when Christ himself, the promised seed, is actually born, because Herod actually did the same thing that Pharaoh did. He killed all the children under 2 years of age in Bethlehem, Judah, and in all the districts in Hebron to stop the Messiah from coming into existence. Now we fast forward to Revelation 12 to the current application, which means the far fulfillment. And the dragon, when he's cast out of heaven, what's interesting is when he assumes this structure on earth, his goal is going to be the same. And that is, Judah has made some promises that he's going to bring the people back to Israel, back to Judah, back to Jerusalem, and he's going to establish his throne and kingdom there. So what the serpent or the great red dragon has to do is stop the tribe of Judah from coming back to the land. And that means he wants to keep them out of the land. And he's going to do whatever he can to destroy them, just like he did in the other two major periods of time in history.
And is this where the 7 and 10 come in?
Yes.
Add to his power.
Yes, and here's the reason why. On Yom Teruah, which is 7th day, 10th month, the 6th festival, something very unique happens. Aaron had 2 goats, and he cast lot. One goat was actually sacrificed in the temple, but another goat was cast out of the temple. It was cast out. He brought it out. They laid hands, put the sins of Israel on the scapegoat. And the Hebrew word is Azazel. And actually in Hebrew, Azazel is actually not a scapegoat, but it's actually one of the fallen angels that led the revolt in heaven. And it's in the wilderness. And it's Azazel.
Wow.
And the King James renders it as scapegoat, but if you look at the Hebrew text, it's a capitalized word, which means it's personifying. And what's interesting is when that goat is cast out, it's just like Satan being cast out of the heaven.
Wow.
So you have the third heaven, the second heaven, and then the first heaven. And Satan is going to be cast down to the first heaven. And there's a special woe in that chapter. It says, woe to the earth because Satan has been cast down. So he's no longer going to wreak havoc in the third heaven or second heaven. He's going to do all the havoc right here on earth. And we would know that as the time of Jacob's trouble. So that prefiguring of Aaron in the temple, the casting out of the Azazel goat, would prefigure the dragon being cast out. And it's on that day, which means that day has special significance on the Hebrew calendar. Right? All right. Any questions about that? Now, what's interesting is the Hebrew scripture says on that day that Aaron must appoint a mighty man, and this is the word in Hebrew, a Gibron. A Gibron. And that's the same root for Gabriel, the angel. And the mighty man must lay hands on the goat and take him all the way out into the wilderness. And that's like Michael the archangel taking Satan, and Michael's angels fought, and they cast him out. So they're casting him out of the third heaven, just like Aaron had to get a Gibron to cast him out of the temple. So it's the same parallelism between the two heavens. So we're going to see that. Now, we're not going to go into it now because the history is kind of involved, but if you look at Hebrew history on Yom Kippur, you would be amazed at the actual assaults that happened throughout Hebrew history on that date, specifically related to the tribe of Judah, which is at Jerusalem. And you even saw it a couple years ago, because now the Vatican is aligning with the United Nations, and they're actually coming against Jerusalem. Now, the official statement of the Vatican is that Israel ceased to exist and no longer will never exist again. So the Pope and the Vatican view Israel as almost a figment of someone's imagination. It doesn't actually exist. It has no role in prophecy. And that is why the Pope gave